Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final track outcomes webinar for the California Adaptation Forum series for track number 3 on catalyzing meaningful adaptation action. My name is Julia Kim. I am the Climate Change and Energy Program Director at the Local Government Commission, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. We have a lot to cover today. I know folks are still going to be trickling in, but I'm actually going to go ahead and get us started so we can preserve as much time as we can for our case study presentations and the panel discussion. So I first wanted to thank all of our forum sponsors for their generous support and making this year's CAF series possible. In particular, I wanted to acknowledge our sponsor, Southern California Edison. And again, just a huge thanks to all of our sponsors for supporting the California Adaptation Forum and our promotional partners. As many of you know, the 2021 California Adaptation Forum focused on the Grand Adaptation Challenge. We explored key challenges faced by California's adaptation community, these challenges both equitably and creatively. And today we'll be sharing some key takeaways and case studies for our third track on catalyzing meaningful adaptation action. It certainly took a village to put this series on, and I want to thank our track facilitators for track 3, Ignacio David, Ben Gelman, and Melody Grubbs. Ignacio, Ben, Melody, I know Ben couldn't join us, so I'll still want to acknowledge him. So 3 of you have been so critical to pulling this series together, and for all of our participants joining us, you'll see just how critical they were in helping us design really meaningful and interactive experiences for our participants as they explored implementation challenges and solutions. I also want to thank our partners over at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Juliet Finzi Hart and Nikki Caravelli, as well as our planning team here at the Local Government Commission, John Vandervoort and Kelsey Wolf. Folks who were able to pull together a really engaging series, and I'll speak to some of what we covered in just a moment. So for those who joined us for our kickoff webinar, you know that we explored a few key case studies of implementation projects, as well as efforts to overcome key implementation challenges, focusing on ongoing efforts to define resilience metrics and thinking about insurance and more. Then at our first workshop, we dove deeper into the specific barriers that adaptation practitioners face along 4 implementation pathways. We looked at social resilience, built infrastructure, natural and working lands, and then landscape level adaptation. Participants also shared strategies and ideas for how we can overcome the identified barriers. At our second workshop, participants worked together to develop project concepts in response to a specific climate impact and community type that we assigned. They were also asked to address some of the key implementation challenges that we discussed during the webinar and at the track's first workshop. We also presented a curveball scenario, and participants had to adapt their concept to changes in political priorities to focus more on the economy and on public health. Participants also engaged in a role-playing exercise to further refine their project concept from the perspective of local planners, state agencies, community members, and funders. And for our third and final workshop, we featured a project troubleshooting lab. So there were 3 real-world projects that were presented, as well as their implementation challenges for participants to collaboratively work to identify potential solutions. So these projects that were presented focused on creating a wildfire risk reduction buffer zone, addressing delta flooding from sea level rise and land subsidence, and then establishing a community resilience hub. And participants also discussed game changers that really catalyze their adaptation efforts, as well as upcoming opportunities to accelerate implementation. I wanted to take a moment to share some of the key takeaways that emerged throughout this series. First, the current funding landscape limits comprehensive adaptation solutions and further fuels capacity constraints. So we all know that more funding is needed to support implementation, but we heard that the way in which available funds are currently structured really limits our ability to advance the equitable, comprehensive, multi-benefit, multi-jurisdictional solutions that we need. Grant programs remain inaccessible for frontline communities, and they also create competitive environments which further strains limited staff capacity. We heard that there's a mismatch in the long-term research and evaluation needed, and the funding programs and how they're focused on short-term results and metrics. We heard that financing and funding are also needed to incentivize community involvement and action, such as for private property owners in the wildland-urban interface. So we heard a lot of ideas for new funding and financing mechanisms, from carbon taxes and VMT fees to second home taxes, tourism sales taxes, using local municipal bonds to leverage grant funding, and more. Another takeaway was that community-driven solutions are already underway, and they should be supported, expanded, and replicated where feasible. So we've heard that community-based organizations throughout the state have been and continue to provide direct services to build community capacity, address community needs, and build community resilience. And moving beyond partnerships that are focused on community outreach and engagement, there's real opportunities to work with CBOs and involve them in implementation efforts as trusted, longstanding service providers. There are many community-driven efforts underway throughout the state to establish resilience hubs, mutual aid programs, land trusts, provide emergency response and workforce development training, increase social cohesion, and so much more. And again, there's just a tremendous opportunity to amplify these initiatives and engage, equip, and empower other frontline communities to replicate successful programs. I should also note that there are calls to provide resources to the community-based organizations that are already doing this important work so their efforts can be sustained. Another takeaway was that we may need to reimagine existing governance structures to enable the type of adaptation projects that we need to implement. So we're seeing a greater focus on regional collaboration, regional planning, regional solutions, rightfully so, to address the landscape level climate impacts that we're experiencing. However, implementation authority lies with local jurisdictions. There also aren't enough mechanisms to fund multi-agency collaborative efforts. The siloed structure of government agencies, as well as funding programs, of course, present barriers to multi-solutions, especially given staff capacity constraints. We heard that the existing scope of government agencies can limit the type of transformative action needed to adapt to climate change, and that decision-making processes do not provide meaningful opportunities for communities to be involved in shaping their future. We heard that actionable research and demonstration projects can accelerate the pace of implementation. So throughout the workshop series, it was pretty clear. Participants were not short of ideas when it comes to adaptation solutions and projects that could be implemented. However, there is, of course, much more work that goes into translating a solution into an implementable project. Which climate scenarios or projections should be used? How do we navigate and streamline permitting processes? What are the true costs of implementation and maintenance? What is the return on investment? How do we measure it? And so much more. There's also a hesitancy to be first. So participants shared ideas for funding design challenges or hackathons for solutions that can encourage innovation and demonstrate replicable implementation projects. Folks discussed creating cohorts of communities or teams working on implementing similar solutions to foster information sharing and collaboration, and also requiring long-term monitoring as a standard practice for all grant-funded projects to measure success beyond the project timeline itself. And finally, collaboration is key to addressing our current challenges and the more difficult challenges ahead. We'll need to make pretty significant, long-standing investments to adapt to climate change, and we need to reach new heights of collaboration to make the best use of our limited dollars. We talked about how there is a tremendous opportunity to implement comprehensive solutions in a way that addresses multiple climate impacts while also addressing community needs that have been neglected for far too long. We heard from practitioners and participants that we need to build political will, we need to close the science to action gap, we need to build trust between government agencies and community leaders and be able to coordinate effectively across multiple jurisdictions. And throughout the series, while folks discussed a number of challenges and potential solutions, it became clear that early and ongoing collaboration can really set the stage and pave the way for successful implementation. So before we move into the case studies, I wanted to open it up for our track facilitators who are on the line with us today, Melody and Ignacio, if there are any additional takeaways that you'd like to share or lift up.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And Melody, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Ignacio. And Julia, that was a great synthesis of all the key takeaways. I can't thank everyone enough that really all these key takeaways came from you participating in the workshop, and I think really represent what's happening out there at a local, regional, and state level. I would just urge you all to continue collaborating, continue learning from each other to identify challenges and develop innovative solutions to overcome and implement meaningful adaptation. It would be great, next time we regroup, that we hear more case studies and more stories, maybe, slowly taking away some of these challenges and solutions and developing some really neat projects to address them. So yeah, over to you, Ignacio.
Yes, and I know I share Ben Gelman is not here with us today, but the team, as well as LGC and the folks at OPR, were great at collaborating and getting everyone to really concentrate on very disparate but very complex problems. And the way I look at it, I work with a lot of communities that face a lot of the different challenges we faced, and everyone is complex, and it's in one part, it's one part of the climate change, economic, and environmental justice challenges that we have. And in some ways, we're probably building toward more solutions because we haven't gotten there yet. We have a Jenga tower of policies and laws that make it very difficult, and the only way to keep this tower from falling down is really to collaborate. So and to find a solution. So I'll hand it off to Julia now. Thanks, Julia and Juliet, and the folks at LGC and OPR for bringing us together.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you, Melody. So another thing that we heard throughout the workshop series was case studies. So we have an exciting set of case studies to share with everyone today. First, we'll hear from Chase Anklehead on community resilience lessons from Boyle Heights. And apologies, give me one moment as I pull up our speaker's bio so I can make sure I'm introducing everyone properly. Apologies, just give me one moment. All right, here we go. On my screen again. Thanks everyone for your patience. All right, so our first presentation will be on community resilience lessons from Boyle Heights with Chase Anklehead. So Chase began his nonprofit journey interning as a community organizer in Washington, D.C., doing environmental policy research, strategy development, and community engagement with the Policy Research Organization. He then moved to South America to work on coastal conservation, environmental advocacy, and education. Back in LA, Chase most recently managed hundreds of volunteers to serve unhoused youth and to fight for more equitable and sustainable housing policy. Today, we'll next hear about the Chino Basin program and how it's shaping the future of water with Sylvie Lee. So Sylvie is the Manager of Strategic Planning and Resources at the Inland Empire Utilities Agency. For the past 20 plus years at the agency, she's been the program manager for some of its largest water resources initiatives, such as the design and construction of the Chino Basin desalters and the Regional Recycled Water Program. Over the past 5 years, she has spearheaded one of the largest and most innovative water resources programs in California, which is the program that she'll be speaking to today. So thank you, Sylvie, for joining us. We'll next hear from Len Matterman about implementing countywide resilience to sea level rise in California's most vulnerable county. In the spring of 2020, Len was appointed CEO of the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District, also known as One Shoreline, which is the first countywide independent government agency in California focused on these climate change impacts. Prior to that, from September 2019 to September 2020, Len served as the first public policy practitioner in residence at Stanford University's Center for the American West, and with colleagues at Stanford and UC Berkeley, he was a contributing author of 2 recent books on financing and implementing large-scale climate resilience, and this follows quite a few additional experiences that Len has had in the adaptation world. So thank you, Len, for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear about the Indian Valley Wood Utilization Campus and how it's restoring forests, creating jobs, and rebuilding hope. Jonathan Kusel founded the Sierra Institute in 1993 and has directed the organization ever since. He received a PhD in Natural Resource Sociology and Policy from UC Berkeley, where he was an instructor before launching the Sierra Institute. His dissertation focused on how rural Northern Sierra communities changed following the departure of the wood products anchor businesses. This work at the intersection of community and forest and watershed health formed the basis for the Sierra Institute's mission and approach. So with that, and without further ado, I will pass it right over to you, Chase, to kick things off.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Chase. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the policy analyst and organizer with Climate Resolve. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the work that we're doing in Boyle Heights with resilience hubs. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with Climate Resolve, we work to build collaborations to champion equitable climate solutions. We have a lot of work in the county of Los Angeles, and we do some state level work as well. We work to build power in communities around climate mitigation and resilience, whether that comes to housing, transportation, cool technologies like cool pavements, cool roofs, planning processes to make sure that we can equitably distribute tree canopy throughout Los Angeles. We also work with utilities like LADWP on outreach campaigns, getting people access to different rebates and stipends and other resources. And of course, it's really important to us to view the global problem of climate change on a local level and make it relevant to people. So we want it to both be understandable for folks, but also for folks to be able to understand how it affects them directly. So to get right into the work that we're doing, we have to understand what is a resilience hub. So a resilience hub in the most simple terms can be viewed as sort of an enhanced community center. We're looking at creating spaces or finding spaces where communities naturally gather, understanding that social cohesion is a really, really critical component of preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. And so taking those spaces that organically exist within a community and co-designing them to meet the physical needs of that space. So having elements like air filtration, backup power, cooling, and other elements, depending on the area, is really, really critical. And those have to be co-designed by the community. So to take that point a little bit further, we can contrast it with how we usually think of distributed sort of resilience spaces in communities. And in LA, what we have as an example are cooling centers. And what you can see in the top left image is a cooling center, and you'll know right away what there isn't, and that's people. And the issue is that we often, when we center a disaster or a challenge, like a heat wave, we think about heat. So our response is, okay, well, it's hot, so we need a cold space. And of course you need a cold space, but there are so many other pieces into creating an organic and resilient space in a community. If you don't have something like childcare, culturally competent communication and advertisement of the space, Wi-Fi, food, maybe internet access with computers, all of those things can really build a sense of community. And on top of that, if you're sort of creating this ad hoc space where people don't normally gather, you're sort of working uphill in that way as well. So that's what it looks like to center a disaster. You think first about the problem and last about the people. But if we invert that sort of view, when we're thinking about creating a space where people can protect themselves from different issues, and we think about the people first, we think about where the people are, that's how we get to the idea of resilience hubs. The U.S. Sustainability Directors Network has done a lot of thinking about resilience hubs and noticed that a lot of mutual aid groups and mutual aid efforts kind of stem organically out of disasters and center around community spaces like churches, for example, where people utilize that space to sort of center their operations and engage in mutual aid. So taking on that idea and thinking more proactively, how can we enhance day-to-day resilience? And so I can talk a little bit about the space that we're working with, but first, I'll get into some initiatives in Los Angeles. In the city of Los Angeles, there was an initial pilot of a resilience hub in South LA with the US Green Building Council Los Angeles and Scope. It can be challenging finding the right spaces. One issue that they ran into is that upgrading the building would trigger a lot of retrofits. And so when you're identifying spaces, that's one thing to think about, is that improving buildings can also require you to bring the rest of the building up to code. But it really did spark a lot of interest in the topic in Los Angeles, and resilience hubs have been included in our resilience plan in the city of Los Angeles called Resilient LA. And so where we have identified a site in Boyle Heights is at the Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory. So the Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory has all kinds of services and programming. So on paper, what they do is career training for youth who are interested in the arts, particularly media arts. But it's also a community meeting place, a space of youth education, and it has a long-standing community history. And really, this space, without any sort of infrastructural enhancement, has already been serving as a resilience hub. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, they have been working with the American Red Cross to distribute materials and information about the pandemic. They've been promoting vaccinations. They held mental health programming for young people throughout the pandemic. They also have a radio station which broadcasts in 3 different languages in the local area, one of which being an indigenous language. And there is a large event venue on top of the hub, as well as a pizzeria that has just opened in the storefront. So there's a lot that can be adapted in that building. And Boyle Heights is really exemplifies a great example of where a resilience hub is a good candidate. It's a very dense community in Los Angeles, has a population of over 99,000 and 14,229 people per square mile. So very, very dense, majority Latino, and a lot of folks in Boyle Heights being foreign born. The median income is substantially low for Los Angeles. And we have a lot of young folks in Boyle Heights with a very old building stock. Boyle Heights has a really long history of community organizing and a really rich sense of identity. And so there is a lot of existing mutual aid and social cohesion in the area, which really lends itself to this idea of a resilience hub. So some of the partners on this project include ourselves at Climate Resolve, of course, the Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory, leading the charge. We're working with the American Red Cross, the mayor's office, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the US Green Building Council Los Angeles, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and the LA Clean Tech Incubator. So our work on this project in particular has been a number of different things. When we first came on the project, we looked at a wide variety of factors. We wanted to look at all of the available data on what threats existed in Boyle Heights. So of course did a climate analysis, looked at liquefaction zones and other issues. These are just a few pieces of some of the things that we looked at in terms of projected extreme heat days, We also were able to look at local air quality stations and compare heat and ozone data and see the correlation between extreme heat and smog. So we're able to tie in existing environmental conditions with projected climate impacts. So we did this analysis. But what's really important, like I mentioned about hubs, is sharing that information with the community and having a co-design process. So we, along with our partners, held 2 different community co-design events where we presented some of that information and had a conversation about what the future of the hub could look like. We asked a lot of different questions. Again, these are just pieces of some of the engagement that we've done. But we identified that power and water infrastructurally were really high priority for the community. We also, beyond those 2 events, really wanted to get an idea of the local community's opinions about the hubs, their hopes, and what they'd like to see. And so we were able to stipend some youth from the Arts Conservatory to do 300 surveys of the local community. And it's a very quite long survey, about 27 questions. But again, these are some pieces of it. And we found out a lot of really interesting information about how people in the local community are adapting to climate change. One thing that we learned is that outdoor cooling is very important to residents. A lot of people talked about, 60% of respondents talked about going somewhere outdoors with shade to be cool on hot days, which we found interesting and has implications for the built environment around the hub. And then 42% of respondents have jobs that require them to work outside. So when we think about heat adaptation, that's another really important consideration. So we learned a lot of information. Another thing that we learned is that there are a lot of people in the area that are medically reliant on electricity. And so that actually also helped shape the feasibility study that we did for a solar and battery backup system on the building. So outside of the direct community organizing that we did and engagement with the local community on our own, we relied on an extensive network of partners in the local area, like Promesa Boyle Heights and Eastside Leads, Inclusive Action for the City, Community Power Collective. I mentioned there's a lot of organizing that happens in Boyle Heights, very, very rich organizations with deep, deep ties to the community, and they were able to give lots of insight and even allow us to speak to some of their membership and do some more engagement, both around the built environment, around the hub and the hub itself. And they spoke also to how they as organizations have adapted to different challenges and how they could fit into a resilience ecosystem. At the statewide level, we've also been advocating for the expansion of resilience hubs and funding for resilience hubs. So we're working, as I mentioned, with the USDN, but the NorCal Resilience Network, APEN, and CEJA. And we were able to secure $200 million in the state budget in the resilience trailer bills for resilience hubs. So we're really excited about that. And we'll continue to work with our partners on trying to make sure those funds are as accessible to community-based organizations as possible. So some other next steps for us, we've just completed the feasibility study for the solar and battery backup system on the building. We've acquired some of the funding for that and are waiting to hear back actually from another funder in early November, and should be able to start work on installing a solar and battery backup system. We're exploring different water storage options for the building. And then in Los Angeles in general, we're collecting data and doing vulnerability assessments for each council district. So we'll be presenting that information to each council member to try and promote resilience hubs in each area. And again, at the state level, we hope to work with SGC to make sure that the guidelines for this funding, the statewide funding for resilience hubs, are really, really accessible and are focused on a community-driven process for designing these resilience hubs. So lastly, I just wanted to share that you can read more about resilience hubs on our website at climateresolve.org/resilience-hubs. We have a fact sheet and share some information from reports from our partners as well. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Chase. Yeah, great to hear about the important work that y'all are doing in terms of moving community resilience hubs forward. It was a huge topic of interest throughout the workshop series, and like you mentioned with the funding, I think it will continue to remain a top priority. We'll pass it over to Sylvie next, but before we do that, I skipped over some logistics before getting started. So just wanted to invite folks to submit questions for our panelists at any point throughout the webinar. You should be able to do that through the Q&A module through Zoom, and you also have the ability to upvote questions that you're also interested in. Feel free to use the chat function. Everyone should be able to fully use the Zoom chat, so feel free to introduce yourselves, share additional resources, share your reflections, and then feel free to chat John Vandervoort or myself, Julia Kim, if you encounter any technical issues or have questions about the California Adaptation Forum. And with that, Sylvie, I'll pass it over to you to share about the Chino Basin program.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited today to talk about a really exciting program that we have here at the Inland Empire Utilities Agency. It's the Chino Basin program, and the Chino Basin program has the opportunity to be a game changer, if you would, on water resources management and how we can work together collaboratively and proactively plan for water resource needs for the next generation. So let me get this started. Okay. So before I get into what is the Chino Basin program, I think it would be helpful to kind of give a little bit of a background on where Inland Empire Utilities Agencies is. We're in Southern California, primarily in the San Mateo County. Inland Empire was established in 1950 as a wholesale water agency and distributor of imported water from Metropolitan Water District. In the 1970s, we also started providing a regional wastewater service to our service area, which is about 243 square miles and serve about 875,000 people. And we are governed by 5 publicly elected board directors. So today we're going to be talking about water in this presentation. So just some stats to kind of talk about our water portfolio. Our region uses about 180,000 acre-feet of water per year, and 30% of that supply comes from the Metropolitan, from the State Water Project, and we're only served by the State Water Project system and do not have any access to the Colorado River. And then 60% of our supplies comes from our groundwater basin, and that's the Chino Basin, and it's one of the largest storage space in Southern California. It's 6 million acre-feet, larger than many of the reservoirs that we have, the surface reservoirs. And then 10% of our supply comes from recycled water, that's generated, of course, from our wastewater treatment plants. So our region, over the last 2 decades, has done really well, remarkably well, with all of the growth that it's had. And it's had 30% increase in growth and 20% in urban water demands. But we have done really well as a region because of our investments in water use efficiency. And going into the future, we are going to be growing over the next 30 years, and we want to continue to invest in local supplies so that we can have reliability as we continue to grow. Now, we are talking about the climate adaptation this morning as we kind of consider all of the impacts of climate on our water resources. We've done a lot of modeling, and it's anticipated that our region's water demands with the expected growth and with the climate conditions could lead to be about an unmet demand of about 40% of 20% by 2040. As a region, we are challenged with figuring out the best way on how we can continue to meet these future demands, one from growth, one from climate impacts. Now, some of the intricate components of other challenges that we're facing with climate is the variability. So I talked about 30% of our supplies, or about 60,000 acre feet annually of our supplies, comes from imported water through the state water project system. And that has a high variability, especially if you put climate into perspective. So right now, it's a very dry year. I think the governor just is about ready to do another announcement on the voluntary reduction to an actual reduction for water use. And that's affected on our snowpacks and how much water we have available coming through the state water project. And there's also another challenge of the ecosystem at the Bay Delta and how that needs to thrive as well. So there's a lot of variability in that source of supply for us. Another one that doesn't quite get talked about a lot is how drought affects salinity in water supplies. So lower water in the reservoirs, there's a higher salt content in it. And then that comes in and it invariably becomes part of our recycled water supplies. And so that salinity becomes a higher salinity is a concern, and we would be violating some of our permits. Now, the last component of groundwater quality, not necessarily related to drought, but it is a component when we talk about looking for reliable supplies. The groundwater contamination, if there are any water quality requirement challenges, that's something that needs to be focused, especially because 60% of our supplies comes from our groundwater basin. So with all of these components together, we have a visionary project called as the Chino Basin Program, or CBP for short, that came up. And there's probably 5 guiding principles that I would say that helped kind of create that vision. We wanted to continue our planning and investments so that we can proactively develop the supply reliability, and talked about a little bit on the permitting requirements and some of the water quality challenges. And so we need to meet our wastewater permit. And as our retail water agencies, they need to ensure that their groundwater that they continue to rely on has adequate reliability built into it. And so when we think about all of these different components, I think it's been highlighted a little bit before, the only way that solutions are going to happen into the future is through partnerships and collaboration. And funding always helps. The additional funding that comes from other sources helps support the local programs, and ultimately it has an impact on how much the local ratepayers alone have to kind of burden. And the last component is, we believe that we need to have every drop of water count within our watershed, so that we have partnerships and to try to put them all together. So these components created the opportunity for us in the Chino Basin. And the idea of the Chino Basin program started probably about early 2017. The Chino Basin program is the first of its kind. to provide benefits to both Northern California and the Southern California through it's a very innovative water exchange program, which dedicates new recycled water supply and provides new infrastructure. And through the water exchange, the state could request for pulse flows of water from Lake Oroville to Feather River in Northern California for the benefit of salmon. The Chino Basin program will provide water that is stored locally as an exchange to our state water contractor or Metropolitan, who's our partner, to facilitate the exchange. So what this program will do is provide 375,000 acre feet of water over 25 years. So this is, in reality, without a big water idea and new ways of managing water, what we did in the past won't be able to secure our future supplies. So this is a one of a kind of collaborative, and as you will see, the number of partnerships that it takes to make a program like this work. So one of the important components and what plays into it is the ecosystem at the Delta, so that we can continue to have reliability in our supply through the State Water Project. So that the concept of the Chino Basin program took into account how a local program can partner with a regional agency, so that's Metropolitan, to provide benefits. Through the exchange, pulse flows of about 50,000 acre feet are released when it's needed for the outmigrating salmonids population. Now, this program, from its concept, has been supported by a lot of the environmental organizations. So our project partner on this one is the Nature Conservancy. And as the program concept developed, we have a lot of support from other organizations like the Golden Gate Salmon Association and other fisheries. And I'm probably forgetting a few of our partners and our project supporters, but it is remarkable on, when we put together how we can have components of a reliability to provide it for the ecosystem and build the local resilience. So a little bit more on how it actually works. So talked a little bit about us having recycled water. So we do advanced treatment of that recycled water through RO membranes, reverse osmosis, and then we will inject it into the ground and put it into storage in our groundwater basin. Now, once it's in storage, we can, when needed, pump that water from our groundwater basin and provide it to Metropolitan through an interconnection. And we can actually pump that water to Metropolitan during dry years or when the water is needed for the exchange. And what will necessitate that requirement for the exchange is initiated by the California Fish and Wildlife on when they make a determination on pulse flows that are needed to help support the salmon habitat. So they will initiate the call and then work with the Department of Water Resources, who then will also work with the State Water Project contractors to facilitate an equivalent amount of water to be exchanged or released at Oroville. So how do we make this happen? There's a lot of technical components of it. Talked a little bit about our advanced water purification facility. It's about 15,000 acre feet a year. And then we store that water into the basin. We'll have a storage account of about 150,000 acre feet for the 25 years. And we're going to be constructing new wells, both for injection, putting the water into the ground, and extraction wells to take that water out of the ground and have pipeline interconnection. One, to put it into the metropolitan system, but also to provide a network of pipelines for our local agencies so that they can share water more effectively during times of need. to promote partnerships within the region. Just as a really quick overview on what that would look like, it's a lot of miles of pipeline and a lot of facilities, which you would see on the right-hand side, the little blue, that's in Rancho Cucamonga, if you are familiar with the landscape of Inland Empire. And that's a 15,000 acre-feet treatment plant. We would have all of these recycled water pipelines to go into some of those dots that you see on the map, which are higher up and they're blue, if you can see that. And then we will have injection wells to put that into the ground. And then we would have extraction wells that provide a capacity of about 40,000 acre feet a year to pump that out of the ground, put it into pipelines, and then provide it to Metropolitan and also be able to use it locally. So a program like this costs in 2019 dollars, $650 million. And what I failed to mention on the previous slide was with this concept and with the support that we've had and the project partners, we were able to go and request, and we were successful in receiving funding from the Proposition 1, from the 2014 Proposition 1 on the Water Storage Investment Program, which set aside funding specifically for water storage programs that would provide benefits to the ecosystem at the Delta. So with this partnership that we've created where we have storage in Southern California and then having a regional agency like Metropolitan Water District coordinate an exchange, we could exchange that water and provide the releases to Feather River and provide a benefit to the salmon. So we received $212 million. And it has been a long project. Our application was back in 2017. We got the funding in 2018. I know that those capital costs are in 2019 dollars and we're in 2021, but this is a big concept and it is going to take quite a bit of years in order to get the collaboration and the partnership developed in order to move it into the next stage of actual design and constructing all of these facilities. So the levels of partnership that is needed over here is intense. There's a lot of state agencies that you see on the slide, along with our Metropolitan Water District, and we have several stakeholders within the region that we've got to get through. So just as a summary, so these are some of our challenges that we have. Institutional agreements, collaboration is great, but it also comes with the number of agreements it has to. And cost is important. And how do we implement programs that are higher cost but provides a benefit for the state? And how do you balance local needs and ecosystem? So with that, I'd like to say that this program has been one of the more interesting ones for us, and it's a very long process. And we hope to have this operational by 2028. And we got a few more years of collaboration. So thank you for your time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sylvie. Yeah, I'm so happy that you shared all the details that went into getting to this stage. Very excited to see how things go as you move towards implementation. So next we'll dig into another water challenge, but focused on sea level rise. So with that, Len, I'll invite you to jump in and share about your work with One Shoreline.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll share screen. Okay, hopefully you can see the title slide. Thanks for including me today in this program and for doing this program. Otherwise, sounds like a great program. So I'm Len Matterman. I run a countywide special district that was created by state legislation that was passed and signed by the governor in 2019. And I'll walk through a little bit of the background and then some of our projects. This graph, I like this graph because it shows the bay water level in San Francisco Bay dating back about 125 years ago, 124. And during that period, the bay has risen an average of 1 inch every 15 years. And on the right side of the graph are the different projections or scenarios for sea level rise. And just to point out that on the low to mid range of those projections, it has SF Bay rising rather than 1 inch every 15 years, 1 inch every 2 years. So, so our assumption is that sea level rise will be substantial. And certainly our population in San Mateo County is aware of all the global warming, climate change issues. And one of the reasons that our agency was created was because of our unique vulnerability, which I'll mention next, and also the other issues that people hear about. And so we have put a strong focus on discussing what we can do locally to adapt and become resilient. So why San Mateo County? Why was an agency created here first to deal with sea level rise? Well, we're the most vulnerable county in California to the first 3 feet in terms of number of people, including underrepresented populations, property value, homes, contaminated sites. One of 6 counties in the United States, and the only one on the West Coast, with over 100,000 people living in that area impacted by the first 3 feet. The graph on the left shows the different Bay Area counties, the 9 counties, and the bars represent a number of homes that are impacted by the first few feet of sea level rise. And the orange bars indicate that those homes are below median income for the county, whereas yellow is above. So in San Mateo County, low income impacts to low income folks is a huge deal for us. So having established that need, we looked previously to the geography, and there are many cities on the bay side of San Mateo County, 12, and dealing with that transformative challenge alone, each city alone doing it just is impossible for all the reasons that you all understand. And there were only 3 cities on the coast side, the Pacific coast. And similarly, although for the kind of an opposite reason, having only 3 cities, Daly City, Pacifica, and Half Moon Bay, to try to deal with such a long geography for our county on the coast side was not practical. And there was a flood control district that was established in 1959, but it only worked in 10% of the county area and nothing on the Pacific coast. So that was quickly dismissed as a vehicle to try to deal with climate change. So the tenets of what was created was to look holistically at the geography, multi-jurisdictional, crossing city borders with the county, working with other agencies, holistic view to the threats, not just kind of traditional flood threats, but looking at extreme storms, as well as, of course, sea level rise, and a holistic view at the objectives in terms of reducing those threats, turning waterways that in many cases had been thought of as liabilities that should be walled off into community assets, and utilizing nature-based solutions in private lands. So we were established in 2019, or at the end of 2019, January 1, 2020. We have startup funding from all 20 cities within San Mateo County, as well as the county itself. Our priorities, there was a project that we inherited in January 1 of 2020, and it had been in planning since 2009, and it was to protect 5 mobile home parks from frequent flooding, one of the poorest and most frequently flooded areas of the county. And we completed a permitting process on that, did the CEQA documents, completed design, put together a funding package among 4 jurisdictions and the state, and secured the land rights in the first about 16 months and started construction. And that was a really important project to start construction, both because it was the right thing to do, also as demonstration of proof of concept for this agency. We're also advancing multi-jurisdictional projects. I'll talk about a couple of those today briefly. We're spending a lot of time working on city planning and land use development in terms of planning for future climate conditions and not today's conditions. And we're looking at with the county looking at a ballot measure to fund water and fire related climate resilience work in the county. Here's a snapshot of the county. I won't go through all of this. This shows the different projects that are in some level of planning, design, or construction. The two that are in construction are the one that I was referring to earlier. It's called the Bayfront Canal and Atherton Channel Project, and the Foster City Levee Project. That's a project not of ours, but of the city of Foster City. The projects that are indicated in blue, we're the lead agency on. And we may be the lead agency on a couple of the yellow ones, but it's not been determined. So in terms of large climate change protection projects, the way I think about it is we need 6 things. The objectives should be meaningful, meaning substantial sea level rise and substantial storms, not 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 feet of sea level rise, but build it now so that we don't have regrets and need to take it out and build it higher or whatnot. Achievable objectives, projects that are manageable in size, locally supported and technically sound, of course. Political leadership is super important. In the development of the district, we had political leadership at the city and county level that was very supportive, as well as our representatives in Washington. And perhaps most importantly, our representatives in Sacramento, which is where the legislation moved forward. And we did receive some direct appropriation in the state budget to start some of these projects. So that's great. Land rights are key. We're working with the private sector. That's a critical piece of the land rights equation, especially when it regards new development. Financing, as I mentioned, we're looking at potential parcel tax countywide. Also looking at financing from the private sector. And I don't call it funding for a reason. It's really financing. And we have our land value is quite high in this area. And we want to capture the increasing the land value in terms of protecting that land. And then finally, permits. Permits are hugely important, environmental regulatory permits. We are advocating strongly that those permits are driven by future conditions and not historic conditions, not current conditions. Our permitting regime at the state and federal level was established really in the early 1970s and not suited well for a dynamic environment and climate change. So that has to change. And so we're working on that. Couple projects to highlight. San Francisco Creek is at the county line, at the southern end of the county line. On the right side of this image is East Palo Alto, which is in San Mateo County. On the left side is the Palo Alto Golf Course. It's a municipal course in Santa Clara County, the other county. And the creek frequently flooded, especially those homes in East Palo Alto, which is one of the lower income communities in our county. And this picture was taken at the very beginning of construction of a project that I'll talk about. This area frequently floods. This is a picture of San Francisco Creek that's within the image at the bottom as well. And you see on the right side a home that is actually below the top of the levee. And so when flooding happens, and it has happened there, it's substantial impact to East Palo Alto, and frequent flood events. And it involves not just homes, but also roadways, including Highway 101 flooding. So a major issue, and we developed with an agency that I ran before I came to this agency, which is multi-jurisdictional, looking at areas at the county line. We developed a massive project to address this issue. Lots of key objectives, including a sea level rise objective that we've taken now to the whole county, which is 6 feet above the FEMA 100-year floodplain, which is equal here to 10 feet above today's daily high tide. Also objectives related to habitat, trails, utilities. I think what might be most interesting, or one of the interesting things about this project, is the diversity of funding. It received large amount from the local community, $37 million, from the state, $30 million, and PG&E, a private utility up here, $10 million. So the project was completed in 2018 at the time, and it still is. The largest sea level rise project in the state of California, about 3 miles of tidally influenced area. So that was a big success for our county and for Santa Clara County. Our objectives, as I mentioned, this shows the daily high tide here at about 7 feet. And depending on what part of the bay shoreline, the FEMA 100-year is about 4 feet above that. If you add in freeboard, you add 2 feet. That's required by FEMA to get people out of the flood insurance program. And then we're going 4 feet above the FEMA freeboard requirement. So all told, it's about 10 feet above the daily high tide. That's how we figure out our project objectives. On the coast side, lots of vulnerability. This is a home in Pacifica, but many of the communities on the coast side, cities and just parts of unincorporated county have erosion issues, significant erosion issues. They were planned obviously at a time when they weren't right on the edge of the Pacific, but that's changing. And we're also looking at how buildings and housing and commercial and industrial properties are developed on the bay side. And here's an example of a housing unit that's new, built right on the bay side and completely unprepared for sea level rise. And the only way to do this, to make this retrofit this property for protection, is to build a big wall right in front of the front door and first floor windows of this property, which nobody will want. And so one of the things that we're really focused on is planning, and planning for this future condition through the coastal plans, general plans, specific plans, zoning ordinances. The first city that we're farthest along with is called Burlingame, which is just south of San Francisco International Airport. We have developed new zoning language that is going into a zoning update by the city that will be completed by the end of 2021. It's gone through City Council and Planning Commission and has to go back to City Council for final approval. It would be the first city in the Bay Area to have incorporate sea level rise into its zoning ordinances for protection. A little bit about the San Francisco airport area. This is a picture or a graphic from SFO about a project that they've been in planning for many years. And what they're planning to do is essentially ring the airport with levees and flood walls. One of the areas that I'll just say that they've been working on this project for a while. They're now in CEQA process on that project. Meanwhile, the city of Burlingame, a bit to the south, developed its own kind of adaptation report at the end of 2019. And in early 2020, last year, the city of Millbrae, which is immediately south of the airport and between Burlingame and the airport, developed its own kind of assessment of its vulnerability and potential strategies. So all three of these entities came to our new district, which is known as One Shoreline, and said, can you help bring us together on a larger project so that we're all not kind of going our own way on this issue, and that our shoreline and our creeks are aligned in terms of level of protection. The area that's in the green circle is the area where SFO and Millbrae intersect, and then Millbrae intersects with Burlingame. And SFO would not need to build this very long reach of the blue dashed line if in fact they tie in to adjoining protection. And so that's what's in it for the airport. What's in it for the cities is SFO controls land rights and that they would need to protect their shoreline. So getting back to kind of the image that you saw earlier, this is the map with sea level rise. And this is the area that's indicated between the airport and Burlingame. So we've developed a project with the two cities and SFO for protection of both cities, including the creeks that flow inland, substantially inland, past Highway 101 to the train tracks for the BART and Caltrain commuter systems. And here's what the project partners would do in terms of sharing their common objectives. Pretty soon I'll wrap up. Here's another potential project of different stakeholders on the coast side. We have the county, the federal government, the state government with Highway 1, a harbor district, all developing their own resilience strategies, and our agency is bringing that together into a regional project. That one is just in the early planning stages. And then finally, we're doing a dashboard, developing a dashboard, looking at flooding issues, not just FEMA flooding issues, but also helping to communicate with developers. Here's a new development that's in planning right now, and they want to build a pedestrian bridge between two halves of their development over creek. And they've come to us to say, okay, how high do I need to build a bridge? So this allows us to inform them. And then it can also look at where future flooding would occur and how that overlaps with housing that's proposed in the general plan as well as important community values like trails and tree cover, impervious surfaces, things like that. All right, thanks very much. Please get in touch. Here's how: info@oneshoreline.org. Julia, back to you.
Thanks so much, Len. So great to hear about the work that you're leading at One Shoreline, and you naturally spoke to so many of the challenges that folks brought up throughout the workshop series. So thank you so much. Without further ado, Jonathan, we'll pass it over to you to share about the work that you're doing in this area.
Great. Let me go ahead and share a screen here. And let me launch this. Good morning, one and all. Thank you for being here. And I love actually following the presentations because of some of the concepts, community activities and collaboration, which underscore many of them. The focus of my talk is on the Indian Valley Wood Utilization Campus. And it's really about restoring forests and creating jobs. And of late, because of the Dixie fire, it is now about rebuilding hope in our community. What you're looking at is a picture of Indian Valley. I'm going to talk about these different things as a part of this conversation. And I won't go through the specific topics, but there are a variety of dimensions to what we're doing. And the Sierra Institute has been involved in landscape work, community building work, rural forest communities in particular for quite a number of years. And when we first started, we were really working to give communities a voice in issues that affect them, and always concerned about landscape implications. This is where we are. And what's so interesting, I really appreciate Sylvie's point about Oroville. This is Plumas County, that left-hand map, and this is where we're located, and this is the headwaters. And this water, this is Lake Almanor, a reservoir. Restoring landscapes, maintaining the health and the viability. It's essential, we think, and I would suggest to Sylvie that we think above Oroville, because all this water ends up in Oroville, and there's about a 14-month flow through for over 1 million acre feet that end up in Oroville. I'll show you this again in a little bit, that barn. That's Indian Valley where we're located. I wanted to just mention briefly, it's not really part of this conversation, but the landscape effort that we're involved in is over 1 million acres. And these are just some of the partners. The white are local public agencies, pink, industrial timber companies and private businesses, orange, environmental groups, green, state and federal agencies, and the purple are the mountain Maidu people. I want to take you back just a little bit for the Upper Feather River Basin fire history. And here is Oroville, by the way. And there is Lake Almanor that you just saw. And these are fires that took place over the last 100 years, or the 1900 to 2000. Here, the arrow is to Lake Almanor again, the reservoir. This is Plumas County. These are fires in the 21st century. A lot of reburning of landscape, over 1 million acres burned. Now, the Dixie fire extends way into this area and out this way, and also down further here. And the Dixie fire was about 1 million acres. More on that in a moment. This is where we're located, the Sierra Institute in Taylorsville. We're familiar with fire. Here's Moonlight Fire of 2007. This is looking out my back door. This is the fire coming over the ridgetop. And this is the result of the Moonlight Fire. This is the Walker Fire of 2020. Here's the result, at least in one part of the Walker Fire, high severity burn in a significant portion of that area. Here is the significance of high severity burn in a study that was done several years, or a number of years after the Moonlight Fire. 38,000 acres out of the 65,000 acres burned at high severity. And 6 years later, in 2013, they found that shrubs now occupied 29% of the landscape in that high severity burn area, compared to 2 to 3% prior to. So it matters. Habitats shifting, and these are the results of that. This is the Dixie fire footprint. There's Lake Almanor again. Here's Taylorsville, where we're located. And here are some of the impacts. This is coming over the hill. We lived it. We were pushed out for 6 to 8 weeks. 4 of our employees lost homes. Here it is coming over one of the many ridge tops that it came over. This is the town of Greenville, the night that it burned up. Hundreds of homes were lost. And this is a landscape just above Greenville, the Wolf Creek drainage. You can see high severity burn because the fire blew through here. This is the Moonlight area, 2007 fire reburned and hammered again with repeated fire. And it will be tough to bring back some of the vegetation here anytime soon. But the story isn't really, it isn't just about the Dixie fire, it's about so much more. These are backburns, and all fire, this is not to say that all fire is bad. This is a backburn to try to combat that fire that was coming down the ridge. Very successful. They all weren't. This shows you an area that was burned severely, but just beyond you can see there's green trees. And this shows you the mosaic burn, high severity burn here, here, and here, but still green. So this is patchy burns. This is not terrible stuff. All fire is not bad. But here's where our work takes off. That is, we have to recognize that forest and watershed restoration in California is just simply not going to succeed unless we simultaneously figure out and invest in wood utilization technologies. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. This is what we used to do and still do in many respects. We make piles, we thin. And by the way, just to go back to the Dixie fire for a moment, Sylvia mentioned the cost of the proposal that they're working on at $650 million. That number, by the way, is very close to what has been spent on just dealing with the Dixie fire alone. So here's piles, and we burn, and people deal with smoke and don't like it very much. So the Sierra Institute started many years ago looking at an old mill site. This is the town of Crescent Mills in Indian Valley. This is Indian Valley. Taylorsville is right over in this area. We looked at this, it's an old Louisiana Pacific mill site, and said, what can we do? How do we rebuild some of the industry to utilize that material, the low value to no value material, so we're not just burning piles? About a 27, 28 acre site. And this is looking at that site in 2018. The challenge is that there were some low levels, but still higher than background levels of arsenic that needed to be addressed. So we started a cleanup. Environmental Protection Agency funded, gave us a number of grants to do brownfields cleanup work in this area. Shout out to Ignacio for his help and his organization's help in helping us secure these grants for this area. So cleaning up the area so it can be put back into productive reuse. This is a vision that we had in terms of, here's forest restoration activities. We can take biomass, logging, slash, et cetera, small diameter material, and go to local sawmills, milled lumber, and we can produce different products. And this is where we're trying to turn low value material into material that has some value. We've learned a little bit. So here's again another slide on the theme in terms of what we were trying to do there. And we're talking about co-product development, not just biomass to electricity. We can create wood, we can make some wood chips, we can do firewood, we can do post and poles. But with the Dixie fire, we needed to do something right away. And this is that part of building hope. And to that end, we just repurposed a grant. Thank you, Sierra Nevada Conservancy. We're buying a sawmill. It's not going to be a large production facility. And we're also looking into making hydrogen and green fuels out of biomass. What's important and central in our work is working at a community scale, not massive facilities that outrun or outscale the capability of the immediate landscape to provide product, but something that is in sync with both the surrounding landscape, the nearby landscape, and the capacity of the workforce to do this work. So we're actually creating local jobs. The first business we put together is making chips, and those chips are going into a biomass boiler that's heating this Health and Human Services Center, the largest building the largest county-owned building in Plumas County. And we're using chips instead of fossil fuels to heat, and it also makes electricity. We put $1 million into the economy putting this boiler in. Local crew did it. We also built the very first cross-laminated timber building in the state of California. Simple structure, but you notice there's no supporting beams. It's 4 or 5 layers thick on the walls, 7 layers thick, and it does a wonderful job of storing carbon. And wood is viable. And interestingly enough, with this material, it is actually quite fire resistant in various fire testing. It works extremely well. We're going to see a lot more of that in California. Silicon Valley has many, many facilities that are planned to use cross-laminated timber. Lawrence Livermore National Lab put out this report a year or so ago, and that's what alerted us to say, wait a minute, we can do something more productive with biomass. And so these are feedstock estimates that they made about how California can reach its carbon neutral goals, and we need to utilize forest management waste. Here's one of the diagrams they put together. I just sort of sillily, in a way, circled those things that we started to focus on in terms of utilizing material in ways that can make a difference. This isn't not in response, but this is something that we talk about a lot, but many people don't understand sufficiently. Here's the Feather River watershed that Sylvie mentioned, and these lines are scaled in terms of where the water, the amount of water that flows and who benefits. 25 million people benefit from this watershed, but it's very difficult to get investment to do the work in this watershed. What's really interesting, when we had some hydrologists from DWR and the state come up and talk about the reduction in flows as a result of the changing forest, they identified, PG&E hydrologists actually identified at Oroville, the flows had declined by over 400,000 acre feet over a 50-year time period. The result meaning that's about 2 to 3% of the delta flow, and their habitat issues that are profound. The group of partners that I mentioned working on this 1 million acre landscape are focused on some of the last free running salmonid streams. We all need to do better in creating partnerships that recognize this relationship between downstream water users, beneficiaries, agricultural beneficiaries, and upstream management. This map is just showing the hydroelectric stations or the dams and reservoirs that are part of the stairway of power. This is the Feather River watershed that Sylvie referred to. And this is reflective of the condition of that watershed in terms of fire severity or risk of high severity fire. There's so much more that we need to think about and that we can do. So now with Dixie Fire, we're working on building a mill. We're working on trying to build that site back into productive reuse to employ people. And we're looking at trying to mill some of the burned wood with that sawmill to make wood for homes so we can get people back into homes. The campfire, which everyone has heard about, almost 18,000 structures burned. Here we are 2.5 years later, and there's still people living in cars and tents. We need to do better, and we can. There are ways of doing it. Lastly, I just wanted to mention, we're also thinking about who works, and we need to think differently about forest jobs and natural resource jobs. We have denigrated those who have worked in the mill sector, worked in the forestry sector, because they're seen as folks who are doing just damage. But in fact, it is not to say all industry practices have been good or perfect, but it is to say we can do better. But we also now need to rebuild this sector of who is involved. And the Sierra Institute just recently received a High Roads Training Partnership grant for $1 million with the focus of employing mostly Native Americans, trying to stand up tribal crews and trying to help tribes build their capacity to manage their own crews across a whole variety of jobs and integrating traditional ecological knowledges into practices on the landscape. Last slide. Just want to mention some of the work that we're doing. It was mentioned earlier, the value of combining research and actual applied work. It's been a hallmark of what the Sierra Institute has been working on for quite some time. This report was just turned into the state. It actually hasn't even been released yet. It will be out in the next month or a few weeks. And that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I love the overlap and the overlapping issues of collaboration, community focus kind of work, and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I remember 7 years ago when I first started working on adaptation issues, biomass utilization was one of the first challenges that I heard about and continue to be an ongoing challenge. So it's really exciting to hear about the work that you're doing to move things forward in the Sierras. With that, I know we don't have a ton of time for questions, but we do have some time. So I'd like to invite all of our panelists to rejoin us in this virtual room and see how many questions we can get to with the time we have remaining. So the first question I wanted to ask, so given the longer timelines for planning and implementing projects, are there any mechanisms built into the projects that y'all have talked about or other projects that you're working on that build in mechanisms to enable an adaptive, flexible approach as new science becomes available, community needs evolve, et cetera?
Well, I'm happy to take first shot at it since so I will. And as I mentioned, it's interesting when we first started into it, we didn't know how exactly we're going to utilize material. We knew that there were a variety of products. We were initially thinking of biomass to electricity. We know that in some cases there's a bad name in large measure because of the large facility and the environmental justice issues that have emerged where some of those facilities are. So that's where we go to community scale. But the adaptive component is when we have new research like the Lawrence Livermore lab report saying, yes, we can do fuels and the technology catching up to being able to do that, we have shifted from biomass to electricity to biomass to green fuels and that kind of thing, and still being able to do that at scale. And by at scale, I mean community scale. So we're not looking at 100-mile radius to haul material.
I could take a shot at it as well. So our project, tied in neatly with what Jonathan was talking about with the Sierra Institute. For us, a lot of it is about providing flows for that ecosystem benefit at the Delta, and that will have an adaptive management plan because it's not just one science fits it all, and there, it's going to continue to evolve on what is needed. And it's that continued collaboration and who's at that, stakeholder table, if you would, to discuss and to kind of provide that flow. So there is going to be an adaptive management plan that is just the nature of water projects.
Jonathan, thanks, Sylvie. We have another question, and this is something that came up throughout the workshops as well. Can you share any strategies for countering NIMBYism and increasing community buy-in for projects that need to be implemented? Any advice or wisdom to offer?
I can take a shot. With this particular project, I will admit we haven't really had any community pushback. But I do think that in general, with a lot of the projects that Climate Resolve works on, we start with a core group of community representatives and use that community expertise and co-design the project, to the extent possible, to build out a core of supporters. And that really provides a lot of organizing opportunities because you can use relational organizing, who do those people know that they can bring into the fold, but really working with I think community leaders, whether those are formal or informal is really important. But you're going to need organic support from some group of folks because there's always going to be people who don't want things to happen.
would just add that the scale of the issue is so large that that communities that aren't directly benefiting from a particular effort, their time will come when they need to be a beneficiary of a project that others will have to also support. And we put together a funding agreement where a very small town was not being flooded, but it was in the watershed, upper watershed, and they found the political will to step up and provide funding for a communal project, because they knew that future projects would be coming their way and they'd be needing the support of their downstream neighbors. So that was really helpful to us.
Just to echo Chase's comment on the value of engaging people to help address some of the perhaps anticipated or existing NIMBYism, bringing folks into this conversation early works wonders in reducing concerns, because when folks see that there are a lot of other folks supporting a project, it's a great way to turn the tide. When we first put in the biomass, or announced we we're going to put in the biomass boiler in the town of Quincy, we held a public meeting and we knew there were going to be some people coming out. But by the end of the meeting, or I should say a day after the meeting, the 4 major skeptics had been reduced to 1. We never did turn that 1, but the other 3 did go along with it. And we said, what are your concerns? And began to address those concerns individually.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan, Chase, Len. Do we have time for one more quick question? This is, I know there were already some responses, written responses to this, but given that collaboration, emerged as a key theme across the workshops, not just for this track, but really across all of the tracks. And I think it continues to come up as a theme in the work that we do. Of course, collaboration takes time, and we are in a resource-constrained environment. Love to see if anyone has any recommendations, any advice, words of wisdom in terms of how we continue to work on these challenges together and collaboratively, just given the capacity constrained environment that we're all experiencing.
For us at Climate Resolve, I think thinking as intersectionally as possible has been really helpful. We're in a resource constrained environment, but if we can expand that environment to include how climate adaptation intersects with racial justice, how it intersects with community empowerment and civic engagement and getting people involved in civic processes, we can also bring in either direct financial resources, or even a lot of the organizations that we work with, they organize around protecting street vendors, for example, but understanding how extreme heat is affecting street vendors is a way to work together within the scopes of each of our organizations and bring different things to the table, so that it's additive rather than people fighting over different pieces of the pie.
2 quick points to add to Chase's comment. One is, we deal with natural resource issues that are often litigated, and collaborative approaches, while they do take time, they take a heck of a lot less time than litigation. Secondly, with our under-resourced or limited resource partners, it's one effective way of addressing those issues is help build the capacity of those organizations separately from the issue at hand. So you're simultaneously building capacity to engage, and you're listening to hearing some of those concerns. So it's a dual effort in trying to address those under-resourced to make sure that we're bringing them along in the process. It is a legitimate concern by many who have limited resources in participating in these collaborative endeavors. So we have to really work hard to bring the variety of folks along in the process.
Right. I know we're almost at the top of the hour, and I want to honor everyone's time and start to wrap up here. So huge thanks to all of our speakers, Jonathan, Chase, Sylvie, Len. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Clearly, the needle is moving on adaptation, and we're seeing implementation projects come online. Really exciting to see how the new funding through the climate resilience budget, especially in future years for implementation, how that will really help us accelerate our efforts throughout the state. I know that if we were gathered here in person, we'd hear a really loud round of applause, but again, thank you so much. And huge thanks to all of our participants for joining this webinar. We hope it was informative and valuable, and for engaging in our workshop series throughout CAF. Lastly, just wanted to flag, folks might be aware of this, but the state's draft climate adaptation strategy is out for public comments. I believe comments are due November 17th. So, you know, it takes all of us, including state agencies, and encourage folks to engage in this process if you have capacity to. And with that, we will wrap up and share the recording and presentations and materials from all the workshops as part of the webinar. Next time.